what it means to be mindful is not some kind of foreign thing. And one doesn't have to enter a different state of consciousness in order to be in that place. It can be, and probably everyone has had moments in their life where they felt really there. They were really available to what was going on, whether that was in conversation with someone or in nature or in a yoga class or what have you. And those are little moments of mindfulness. So I think it's very important for people to know that everyone's got the capacity. It just needs to be watered. It just needs to be nurtured into growing.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season includes 25 incredible episodes devoted to the inner development goals. Based on the science of personal transformation, the IDG framework represents 23 skills needed for today's world. And of course, empathy is one of them. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Kirk Warren Brown, a research faculty member in the Department of Psychology at Carnegie Mellon University. Kirk has made monumental contributions to understanding human well-being and mindfulness. His research highlights the critical role of self-awareness, both of our internal states and behavior, in achieving healthy human functioning. With a deep interest in mindfulness training, Kirk has explored how it can enhance not only personal, but also collective well-being. He's the author of numerous scholarly articles on these topics and serves as the senior editor of the upcoming Handbook of Mindfulness, set to be published in 2025. His work has been recognized globally and featured in national and international media outlets, and he's been named among the top 1.5% most cited authors across all scientific fields, an incredible testament to the impact of his work. He's also a fellow of leading professional organizations, including the Association for Psychological Science, the Society for Social and Personality Psychology, and the American Psychological Association. I've invited Kirk to join this special IDG series because his work exemplifies the presence trait within the Inner Development Goals framework. Welcome to the show, Kirk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Sweet. There's so much to unpack, and I'm especially excited to have this conversation because you probably don't know this, but I just came back from my first ever 10-day Vipassana retreat on Sunday. So this is very alive for me, and I'm excited about all what we will cover. The first thing I might want to ask you is, you're a scholar and a well-cited scholar. Obviously, your research lab is doing such important work in mindfulness, but I'd love to know on a personal level, what's the backstory that brought you to this research and why you found it so important to pursue?
Well, I got interested in mindfulness and presence when I was a teenager. I was about 15 and started reading in that vein. I started with a book by Peter Matthiessen, who was a well-known writer and Zen teacher himself. And his book was about his journey into Tibet in search of the mysterious snow leopard. And the title of the book is called The Snow Leopard. And the other plot line of that book was his journey into Buddhism and Zen in particular. And reading that book was really a turning point for me. I had grown up in a evangelical Christian home, so it was a very unusual thing for a kid like me to be getting into that line of interest. But it really struck a chord with me, and it kind of was cloistered away for quite a while until I became a graduate student and then a postdoctoral scholar, at which point I had opportunity to start researching this myself. At that time, the whole concept of mindfulness and presence was very much off the map. And It wasn't until I became a postdoc that I had opportunity to start exploring that. Fortunately, under the guidance of a sponsor who was willing to go with me there at a time when it was still quite unknown.
So I am fascinated by the idea of how your personal identity must have been a bit shaken if you grew up in an evangelical Christian home and came across alternative philosophies, how that must have shaken your worldview and your relations, not only to yourself, but to also your family and community. I wonder if you would share a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, it was quite an unusual pivot point. And I remember the first time I went to a Zen center, walking up the driveway to the center, my heart was pounding and the thoughts were running through my mind. What are you doing? What are you doing? And I was really struck by that experience in that a lot of it was very kind of foreign and it was painful, to sit in meditation at that time when I was just beginning. But I met someone there who's a senior student, and he was just asking me about, what I was doing in school, et cetera. But he had these piercing blue eyes that just was, I got the sense he was just looking at me, and in a way that very few people do, as if he was really seeing me. And that stayed with me. And I did have some conflicts with my parents. My father, in particular, was very dedicated Christian. And ironically, it wasn't until I got into studying Buddhism and mindfulness that I really started to appreciate the Christian message, because I was looking at the Gospels in particular with really fresh eyes, and I could see the revolutionary message of this teacher, Jesus. And that actually was helped to preserve a bond, if you like, with my family, although they never really kind of got the whole Buddhist thing. But fortunately, they were liberal enough to let me go my own way.
I'm really moved by that story of that gentleman with the blue eyes. I can sense how important, I think you can conjure up the feeling of what it meant to be seen by him. So thank you for sharing that. That was an
Mm-hmm.
incredibly emotive story. And it sounds to me, because I had the final follow-up question, I was going to ask, do you see alignment at all between the Buddhist philosophy and the Christian way of being? And it sounds like there are many threads of that you can see that overlap or that find harmony. It's not like they exist in opposition in any way.
Yeah, I was at a conference with the Dalai Lama and Christian teachers and Buddhist scholars all on a stage together. And the Christian teacher and the Dalai Lama were having this conversation. They were speaking in different words, but it's like they were talking the same language. And I think there's something about the contemplative traditions in Christianity and Buddhism, and since then I've seen it in Sufism um, and Judaism as well. That there's a way of being in the world which has to do with being present, of really showing up for one's life as it's unfolding, and that creates an inner world that I think all or many of the traditions that I've encountered seem to honor and want to encourage people to cultivate.
I sense I'm using this phraseology like we're off to the races, which makes it sound like it's going fast, but I actually feel my body settling into this conversation in a really different way. Like you're bringing a cadence and a vibrational, I don't know what, through the Zoom call where I'm feeling extremely present for this conversation. So thank you for that. And since we
Mm.
are talking about presence, let me want to ask you how you define presence, but the IDGs, I'm looking at this little tool, the Inner Development Goals framework describes or defines presence as the ability to be in the here and now without judgment and in a state of open-ended presence. I want to know if that resonates or what you have as a working definition, or how would you, in a lay way, describe presence?
Yeah, I think what you described is very on point. I think in a straightforward way, presence is about showing up for one's life, for one's experience, moment to moment. And perhaps a way to best describe it is to give an illustration. So, for example, I'm looking at you now, and I am have some notion of who you are and what your background is, and what kind of work you do. And I could approach you in a way that for which that serves as a filter through which I encounter you. But I can also encounter you in a way that is very direct, that is very much showing up for who you are in this moment, not what your backstory is, or not who I think you are, or not what I think you're going to say or do. And that's a kind of way of being that encounters life directly, more directly than we're used to. And I think it really changes the way we relate, not just to people, but to our own inner experience, to the world in general.
I love that because there's what it raises for me is I teach a social entrepreneurship class at McGill, and one of the exercises we do as a class is the public narrative, which I picked up from a professor at the Kennedy School by the name of Marshall Gantz. And he calls it a leadership skill where we do the self, us, now, and it's storytelling that has like a moral authority thread through it, and it's about action taking. Anyways, every student in the class, there's about 40 on average, does a 3-minute public narrative. And I say to them, this is not about sort of bringing up dirty laundry. We're not a group therapy session. I don't want you to feel like you have to go to a traumatic story, but just share a story that's meaningful to you, and show up with courage and vulnerability. And I
Mm.
invite everyone, if they elevate themselves to have that capacity for courage and vulnerability, and everyone around them does it, we're going to have a breakthrough class. And it
Mm.
never, 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 never fails. If everybody does show up and they do, like there's an, I think, an inner desire, like you described earlier, to be seen, and how wonderful, delicious that feels. And to see others without that filter that you just described, everybody kind of shows up as themselves, and everyone listens to one another without this frame of like looking for a filter word that might categorize somebody or throw somebody off. There's just so much generosity in the room and so much unfolding that you create this incredible community in one evening that can never be taken away again. Once you've seen
Mm.
someone, that's like a really big gift to the relationship. I think that's what you're describing.
Yeah, very much. And what one little thread that I took away from what you just said was these experiences when we're really are present to people, it's very memorable. It becomes kind of part of our makeup. And I think for many people, they want to encourage that. They want more of that. And that leads them, or can lead them, into cultivating this notion of presence, which of course many people are trying to do these days. So I think that notion of courage, of vulnerability, is very much a part of what it means to be present. Because in a sense, it means being honest, being genuine, really noticing, accessing, acknowledging what's taking place within oneself, in another person, and being willing to meet that in a very direct and honest way.
So do you have a sense through your research or even through your lived experience to share a thought on why we have the capacity to be present for others? Like, let's say somebody wants to meet me for a cup of coffee, a student, a mentorship meeting, and I'm very present. Or there's a work meeting, I'm very present. And why it's harder to be present with those that are most dear to us, our children, our spouses, our mothers, like, I don't know, is that a universal thing or is that just a me thing? Why is there that struggle to be present with
Yeah.
what you care most about?
I think it's one way in which that becomes difficult is because we have so much backstory about them. We start seeing them through the filters of our memories of them in the past, um, of our uh, emotional experiences with them, whether that's positive, negative, or neutral, um, uh, through the filter of our habitual ways of interacting with them. And so I think all of that makes it, yeah, more challenging than it is to meet someone freshly who we don't know because we don't have any of that. We're willing to let that encounter unfold as it will. So it is ironic in a sense that, the people we most care about are the ones that we find it most difficult to really show up freshly for. But of course, that's where it can become very enriching to our lives when we're able to do that. And it's easier when both parties in that exchange are on the same wavelength, but it's not necessary. In fact, our research shows that if just one person in a couple, for example, encounters even a difficult conversation with presence, it changes what happens. And they come out of that exchange with more love, more commitment, less anger and hostility, less anxiety. And that's very simply because they have been able to show up for that person. And I think we don't really understand why that happens, but I think it's because, as in my example that I described when I was a kid, people feel seen when someone is really there for them, and it encourages them to become present themselves, I think.
Now, I talk about what it's like to try to be present for someone sharing a story. So this is sort of like an empathic journey. We know the neuroscience is that when your amygdala is firing, if you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed, you can't really access empathy in a real way. So you have to develop some self-awareness about how you're feeling. You have to develop some self-regulation, skills so that you can calm yourself down. Then you can pivot towards being present and then sort of create a space for, holding space for someone to share something. And I talk about the importance of silence and how helpful silence is, where we have a tendency to speak, talk about a solution, share why, oh, I totally relate to you. And we think that those are all sort of helpful. I wonder if you could just, before we move on to sort of some of the skill training and the work that your lab is doing, because I have so many other questions, but thank you for indulging all these, unplanned questions. I wonder if you could speak to what we can develop as a skill when we are listening to someone share a tough story, they're in pain, and we want to soothe them, and what you'd have to say about being present, like what is useful in those moments?
Yeah, I think the most important thing one can do is tap into what's going on oneself. How am I reacting to this? How is this being taken in? And that does ask for some turning inward, which may seem kind of unusual when you're in the moment of an exchange, but sometimes that just means asking, hey, give me a moment. I want to process this. I really want to take this in so I can really hear you. So it may involve a little bit of norm breaking, social norm breaking in that way. But as I think we become more able to access our own inner lives, that can become very spontaneous and very easy to do. So I think that's the first thing, is to really tap into asking, how is this person, me, taking this in? And then relaying that to the other person. Hey, this is what I'm hearing. This is how I'm responding to that. And I want to help you access what's going on for you. And I'm not; these are not the words one necessarily would use, but this is kind of the spirit in which that could be conveyed. I really want to hear you. I really want to know what's going on for you, and I'm here for you. I want to help you in the best way I can, and that means really showing up for you right now. So these are just not prescriptive lines, but just ways of being with the person and conveying that kind of message that I'm here.
And what I'm hearing from what you're saying in this exchange is to actually uplift and acknowledge that there's a whole bunch of sensations in the body, a whole bunch of emotions that are rising, and actually giving them room at the table.
Yes, absolutely. It really is about offering an invitation to that person to open up to their own experience and to share that experience with someone who is not threatened by it, who is not put off by it, who's not judging that person for what they're expressing or what they're feeling. So there is a way in which, when one person is present in an exchange, it's an invitation to the other to be just as present with themselves and with the other person. And out of that can come, again, we don't know the outcome of that, but it does open up the possibility for some healing.
Yeah, I do believe that. I really do. So that's an interesting segue to this question that I definitely want to ask you and talk about. The Wellbeing Lab at Carnegie Mellon that you direct, the purpose statement reads, to help create a world that supports personal and social well-being. So I want to actually do a deep dive on this, on the social well-being aspect, because what we've described so far is, how there can be healing in a relationship, how the relationship itself can improve through presence, but how do you make the leap to the social well-being part?
Yeah. First of all, that whole notion of social well-being is very broad. It's really an umbrella term for all kinds of things. So it could refer to the well-being of the person's own social world as they embody it. So one of the things that we study is loneliness, for example, or a sense of belonging, and the sense of social connection that people can have. That's very much an inside job. And the other way in which we explore it is how people relate to each other at an interpersonal level. So, one-on-one or in small groups of people. Another kind of another layer, if you like, of how we explore that is, how do people relate across different social lines or social categories? So one of the things we study is how presence can help to change the way that people interact or relate to each other when they believe that their personalities are very different, when they recognize that they are speaking to someone from a different racial group or different ethnic group, when they are in a situation where they're encountering someone from a very different political orientation. So these are all ways in which we study social well-being, all the way up from, the kind of microcosm to potentially, what's going on in terms of broader social groups.
So I think that's so important, especially now with all the polarization we're seeing. And I noticed one of the research papers that was on your the website of your lab was a research study on the short-term training in mindfulness and how it can predict helpful behavior toward racial in-group and out-group members. That caught my attention. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more, because as somebody who studies empathy, I know that we have the tendency as a species to empathize with people who are most like us, look like us, eat like us, vote like us, play like us, and that it's harder as the concentric circles grow and you're speaking about the other, it's harder to empathize with them. So let's talk about this a bit.
Yeah. So we had some sense that presence, or which, by the way, I consider to be kind of like a core component of what we think of as mindfulness, was related to empathy. So there'd been some work done on that before we came to the table, and we wanted to know, well, okay, is that true? And could even just a brief cultivation of presence facilitate that person's ability to empathize with someone who was very different, in this case, who was from a different racial group? And we set up a little scenario in the laboratory where we had them observe someone being ostracized, being excluded from a very simple ball tossing game, which sounds very benign, and in one sense it is, but people, when they're in that position, feel very distressed by that. Even in something like a game, they feel we're hardwired to stay connected with other people. And when we feel excluded or ostracized, it's very upsetting. So we had our participants engage in a mindfulness exercise, just 10 minutes, and then observe someone being excluded in this game that they were witnessing on a computer screen. And then we gave them opportunity to, and the person being excluded was from a different racial group than the participant themselves. And then we gave them opportunity to send emails to the players in that game, to the ones who had perpetrated the exclusion, to the one who was the victim, in a sense, of the exclusion. And also, as a follow-up, gave the participant, the opportunity to enter the game with the same people and ask, hey, what do they do? And what we found in both of those different outcomes that I described is people were more empathic when they were sending emails to the victim of the ostracism, as coded by our blind research staff. They also tossed the ball more frequently to the ostracized player, and in a significantly greater extent than from people who were in a control condition that didn't receive that mindfulness exercise. We then followed that up with another study in which we had people do a 4-day training in mindfulness, getting guided mindfulness instruction every day for 4 days. And before and after the training, we kind of introduced a confederate, essentially an accomplice of the research staff, who presented an opportunity for others to help them. So in one case, it was somebody on crutches who came in and didn't have a seat. Would the participant give up their seat? In another case, it was somebody who came in down the stairs and spilled a bunch of papers, et cetera. Again, like very benign kinds of things. But what we found was that people who had received the mindfulness training relative to those who did not were um, much more likely to help than people who didn't. So what we were able to do is create kind of a 3-point chain from cultivated presence to empathy to prosocial behavior. So empathy, in a sense, became a catalyst that helped to encourage um, helping um, altruism that was spurred by these little exercises in presence. And what was really striking to me about that is, when we speak about mindfulness training or training to become more present, we think about this as a very long, drawn out process, something that can take weeks or months or years, something that you need to go on a 10-day retreat for, or 2 months of mindfulness-based stress reduction training. And that's very true. I think as we do develop this capacity more and more over time, we become more capable of being present. But what was really striking to me is that with these short-term trainings, it seems to be that everyone's got this capacity just lying latent in them, ready to come out with a little bit of push, a little bit of invitation, if you like, to become available, and has these cascading effects. That was very striking to us.
What is your theory on why that happens? Why is mindfulness effective at creating this pro-social behavior, or at least the tendency or likelihood for it to happen?
Yeah, and empathy seems to be the driver of that. And so for us, the question is, or has been, um, how does something like presence or mindfulness encourage empathy? And that's been a very important question for us and for other researchers who are in this area of work. And we don't know. It's kind of a mystery, I should say, at this time, because it really means kind of going into that person's inner world and asking what's going on there when somebody is present or learning to become present. And we can speculate is that as the person tunes in to what's going on internally, what their thoughts are doing, what their emotions are doing, what sensations are present in their body, that they become available to themselves in a deeper way, and that helps them to become available to others in a deeper way. So just as they can see themselves more clearly, they can see the other person more clearly and more freshly. And that's kind of the bleeding edge, if you like, of what we're exploring as we go forward in this work.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have a theory of my own too, and I'll share an experience that I do with my students, and I do on like workshop training sessions where we do eye gazing exercise, right? It's a 2-minute eye gaze,
Mm-hmm.
partner up, and I do it in 2 steps. So there's the first 30 seconds where they're simply eye gazing, and there's the giggles that go through the group, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people holding their hands in their pockets or crossing their legs. Like you can see a lot of physical evidence that people are not comfortable. And it takes
Yeah.
a lot of vulnerability. We're not used to it, and it's like an intimate thing. So after the 30 seconds is over, for the next 90 seconds, and I prime them, I say the 90 seconds sounds like it's 3 times the length of the 30 seconds, but I'm going to do something with you that's going to make it feel a little bit shorter. Just trust me, And so, people and I invite them to check their body language and stand in a more neutral stance and whatnot. And then when the 90 seconds starts, I'll start talking, and I'll say, what I'd like to invite you to do is to take a nice, long, deep breath in and feel it go all the way to the top, and then take the breath all the way down through your body and into the earth, right? So I'm bringing attention to their breath. And then I'll invite them after a moment of silence, I'll say, I invite you to really see your partner. And they'll be, and then another deep breath. And then I'll invite them to give themselves permission to really be seen. And another,
Mm.
so they have things to think about and things to do through those 90 seconds. So it actually feels like it's not this like unending period of time. And at the same time, so here's my theory on this, is that as they're doing deep breathing and as they're relaxing into this without feeling the stress of like looking at somebody and feeling looked at and
Yeah.
potentially, I feel like whatever's firing in their amygdala or causing them any kind of stress gets diminished. Now, not always and not always perfectly, but they're accessing more of their capacity to be in this open connection type experience because they're not as stressed. So I feel like maybe the mindfulness training is the skill of us always working on this old operating system of the reptilian brain, like searching and scanning for what threats exist, right?
Hmm.
And actually becoming a little bit less fearful of whatever the environment or the person is, so that we can be more empathic to one another. That's what comes up for me.
Yeah, and I think what's I think important in that experience that you just described is it's not that those fears and self-consciousness go away, but they can be seen. One can, in a sense, kind of stand apart from them so that they don't overtake one. So yes, the amygdala may be firing. There may be those feelings of threat or anxiety or thoughts about, what are they thinking of me, et cetera. And if I'm a little bit more able to see those, they have less opportunity to influence how I respond. And so I think that's a very important point to make because sometimes people have the idea that if you're present, if you're mindful, you're not thinking, you're not feeling things in the way that you normally do. In other words, like your mind is like a blank slate, and that's really not true. The mind is always doing its thing, but we can see that. We can get a little bit of distance from that thinking mind and that feeling body and brain, and become more choiceful, if you like, about how we want to respond because we have ceased to become overtaken by those thoughts and feelings.
Love that. Love that. So your book is coming out, the Handbook of Mindfulness, the second edition, coming out in 2025. This episode is launching in January of 2025, or maybe February. I can't remember the exact date, but I want to encourage some people to go pre-order a copy, or if you're listening to it after it's come out, to go order a copy. So I went in and looked at what some of the content is. And we won't be able to, due to time, maybe speak to each of these, but I'll share two or three things that caught my attention. And maybe if you want to share something that you'd like to, put a pin on, I invite that. So the Handbook of Mindfulness. It looks at contemporary psychological science, so like hard science, and the relationship to ancient contemplative traditions. And I just love how I feel like science is catching up to what the contemplative traditions have been saying for millennia. So that's one thing that, we could maybe talk about. Another one that caught my attention is that emotional regulation processes and interventions, mindfulness practices can actually have a big impact on chronic pain, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
so fascinating. And then there's also a chapter, as I understand, on adapting mindfulness-based research and interventions specifically for some racialized communities. So those
Mm-hmm.
are a few things that caught my attention. I wonder if, what's alive for you to talk about.
Yeah. What I think what one thing I can say in a very broad sense is that mindfulness is an aspect of consciousness, and there's no domain of human activity for which our consciousness does not have some role to play. We're always attentive to something. Yeah, one of the things that we've been seeing over the past decade, 2 decades, is just this explosion of research on mindfulness as it has expanded out into a whole range of categories of not just psychology and psychiatry, but also into medicine and the humanities like sociology and religious studies, etc. And yeah, there is a way in which we are kind of catching up to what has been in these different cultural and religious traditions for a long time. We're at a really fantastic time in the sense that we have opportunity to in whatever illness or condition or circumstance we may find ourselves, that presence has something to say, that it can be a core component of what it means to be a person who struggles, who has anxiety issues, who has mood conditions like depression, who has pain, who has conflict with other people. And that's just what it means to be a conscious human being, is that capacity for presence can come out and influence a whole range of human experience.
So Kirk, how do we do it? How do we practice presence and mindfulness? What's the way to do this without it seem daunting? Because I know we're all supposed to like sit there and and we've got the apps to download and we're supposed to spend an hour a day and like, what do you do?
Yeah, Buddhism, there's this notion of Dharma gates, that there are many gates or doorways into presence. And that's can be different for different people. And there are all kinds of ways in which that can happen. So for one person, it may be yes, meditation, which is still and for a long time has been kind of the main gate, if you like, to cultivating presence. There is a sense in which when one sits down with an app or with a teacher or with other friends to practice presence, that there is, to put it one way, there is no escape from your mind. And that can be very challenging for people. And as we all know, there are many, many apps out there that people have tried and given up on. And so this is all to say that the gate of meditation is not necessarily an easy one. And it's very important, I think, to have a good teacher. That can make the difference between proceeding along the path or stopping and moving on to something else. But having said that, there are all kinds of ways in which we can be present. For some people, it's just being present to their bodies as they walk from one place to another. For someone else, it may be gardening. For someone else, it may be cooking. There are all kinds of ways in which we can deliberately or volitionally show up for our own experience as it's unfolding moment to moment. I would encourage people who have tried to cultivate presence to not give up on it. Try a different doorway. Try connecting with a group that, for example, meditates together or does gardening together or what have you. See if you can find a teacher. And of course, there are many teachers out there who can be very helpful in this regard, who can help you cultivate this. One doesn't necessarily have to become a Buddhist, to cultivate presence. As we know, it's everywhere now. And if you've tried it, just know that any kind of habit that we want to instill often takes time. And we sometimes we fall off the wagon, we fall off the bike, we get back on again, and we get back on again. Don't let that be a discouragement.
Yeah, I remember years ago taking one of my first ever meditation classes, and we were all given a raisin. With
Hmm.
and just the idea of like holding the raisin and sensing its squishiness and the scent of the raisin, and then popping it in your mouth and chewing on it and tasting it and just bringing real attention to this like little raisin, you know? And then at some other point, I remember going on a weekend retreat, and they had breakfast in the cafeteria, and everybody ate in silence. And now I just came back from Vipassana. It's 10 full days in silence, and how our
Hmm.
relationship to food and eating in silence makes you taste the food differently and eat more
Hmm.
slowly. So I love the idea of like just going from one place to another and being mindful of your body in motion as just that's so simple,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point in that what it means to be mindful is not some kind of foreign thing. And one doesn't have to enter a different state of consciousness in order to be in that place. It can be, and probably everyone has had moments in their life where they felt really there. They were really available to what was going on, whether that was in conversation with someone or in nature or in a yoga class or what have you. And those are little moments of mindfulness. So I think it's very important for people to know that everyone's got the capacity. It just needs to be watered. It just needs to be nurtured into growing. And your experience with the raisin reminds me that there are many, many classes now that are offering mindfulness training, like mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And those are readily available either in one's community or online. And many therapists are incorporating mindfulness into their therapeutic practices. So if you feel called to that kind of work, you can get exposure too. So um, yeah, just know that it's not our habit where we don't live in a culture that encourages this kind of being in the world, but it's right there. It's just right there through that doorway waiting to be accessed. And that's certainly something that our research has shown too.
And I think that's why I love the conversation is that it's coming from research that's evidence-based on how effective this can be on so
Hmm.
many parts of our lives. So, Kirk, this has been a great conversation. I have two last questions, and thank you for the work you do and for the time you've given to this episode. Penultimate question would be the Inner Development Goals framework was developed, I think, in response to the fact that the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are so far from being achieved. You know, we're at
Mm.
2024 now as we're taping this, but it was 6 years to get to the goalpost of, reducing poverty and ending gender discrimination and reversing climate change and all these
Mm.
goals. And we've achieved sort of 12% of the goals, which is
Mm.
like nothing, right? And I understand that the backstory of the IDG framework is like, whoa, what can humanity do differently? And the question really kind of got narrowed down to like, what kind of leaders do we need to make the decisions that are needed for the world to get to a better place? And through all of their mapping with social scientists and research scholars and systems thinkers, they came to this framework across 5 domains, and one of them is the being domain. It's the first domain, and presence is
Mm.
one of the skills to develop. So I wonder if you could make the case, because you've done it sort of like on a personal level, but
Hmm.
why do you suppose developing presence is so important for leaders and citizens of the world to create the better world that we want to pass on to future generations?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Um, One of the things that presence and more broadly speaking, mindfulness does is it helps us to see how deeply interconnected we are to others, to the world. And so when I, for example, look at a piece of paper, I can just see it's a piece of paper. But in that piece of paper is the wood that it came from, the people who milled that wood and turned it into paper. I can see the rain, the clouds, the earth that nurtured those trees into being. And all of that is in there. All of that's in that piece of paper. And so when we become present, it's not just about becoming present to our sensory experience, what we see, what we hear, what we touch, taste, etc., which is all certainly part of it. Those are all very important gateways. But presence is really about waking up to the fact that, hey, I'm no different than anyone else here. And I am intimately connected to the human community and to the larger biotic community that sustains humanity. And I'm connected to the earth, to the planet as a whole, and its self-organized way of functioning. And every molecule we breathe has been breathed by someone else. As another example of that, every cell in our bodies is no different than the cells of any other being. When you take off the outer layers of how our personalities differ and how our geographic regions of origin differ, we're all we recognize that we're all part of one community. And that just extends not only to humanity, but to really all sentient creatures, to the planet as a whole. So that's a very kind of big scope, I realize, but that notion that we are intimately connected to everything that exists around us is fundamental, I think, for not just every person to recognize, but particularly for leaders to recognize. And that may change the way in which they lead. That was very kind of long-winded. I feel like that was rambling too, but sorry about that.
Not at all. And I love.
If you want to do that again, I'm happy to.
No, that was not rambly at all. And I love the fact that you talked about the piece of paper. I mean, it has echoes of, I think, Thich Nhat Hanh, he writes about this.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to include that in the show notes for anybody who's curious and is sort of, flirting with this presence, mindfulness stuff and hasn't, is not a practitioner just yet. It's a great reading. My last question, which I love asking guests, Kirk, if you can think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
Yeah. So, I have an experience in mind. I'm just looking at how to frame it. So about 10 years ago, I went through a relationship breakup that was felt very it was very difficult. It was very challenging. I had a setback in my professional life, and I fell into what was a pretty deep depression. And in the midst of that, which I was really trying to get through on my own, friends started showing up. People who had for whom I had not shared this kind of experience with, or who were not professionals in any way. There were just people who cared and cared enough to want to support me in going through that. So that was an experience that was very powerful example of being on the receiving end of empathy. And I'm forever grateful to those people. And for me, it became a real testament to how important our as we call it in Buddhist circles, our Sangha is our community, is to supporting who we are.
Kirk, I just missed that last, you froze for that last sentence.
Okay.
You said, I was grateful to your friends, and then I lost the last sentence. Do you mind repeating that if you can?
Yeah, let me backtrack a little bit further than that, because I feel like I want to say it in a slightly different way. One of the things that I took out of that experience was that there are people in our lives, and I think I'm not alone in this regard. There are people who are ready to help us if we only give them the opportunity. We live in a very individualistic culture in which we feel like we need to power through when we're suffering. We need to bear up. And that experience was a real testament to me of how I am supported by my community. I'm not and never have been alone. As much as, I have felt that way sometimes, as much as I'm sure other people have felt that way at times, that there are people out there who are just waiting for the opportunity to empathize, to be of support to us. And my experience certainly bears that out.
Well, I'm happy that you gave your friends and others permission to support you in that way. And I'm so glad you felt supported in that really rough experience. I love this question with all my guests. I never know what story I'm going to hear. Part of me is I always sink into this because I am personally reminded by the end of this conversation about the gift that empathy can be to others, and it's available to us all the time. It's not a big, heavy lift necessarily, and it can have really big, meaningful impact on the recipient. And so, I guess the invitation always is, let's turn up the volume of empathy in our lives. And thank you for your time, Kirk. I really appreciate having had this hour with you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Anita.
Thanks to everyone who's been watching or listening, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who'd benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Post the link on your socials and hit the subscribe button now. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.